Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Yudalid, Parshas Eikev, Sicha Beis, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learn about the mitzvah to teach one's son's Torah, and the Gemara learns from here that women aren't part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and there are 4 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, present a halacha from the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe about this teaching and ask a question on it. Number 2, present another related teaching from the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe about this and ask 4 questions on it. Number 3, answer all the questions and also present a side discussion, a short side discussion. And number 4, present the pnimius einonim of all this. From the pasuk in our parsha of V'limadatem oisem es b'neichem, they should teach your sons Torah. So they learned in Gemara that women aren't part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The Gemara over there says the Amar Krab, because the pasuk says V'limadatem oisem es b'neichem, you should teach the Torah to your sons. B'neichem v'lei b'nei seichem, your sons are not your daughters, and exactly how we learned that women are not part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah at all, even for themselves, is explained over there in the Gemara. Now the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch teaches this halacha that Isha eina b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah chulu, that a woman is not chayiv in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and he continues, and just like a woman is not part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah la'atzma for herself, so kach eina b'mitzvah Talmud Torah lebaneha, she's so too not part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah in regards to her sons. And she's patur, she's exempt for paying for her sons to learn Torah. The Alter Rebbe continues in Mekomakim, and nevertheless, if she helps her son or her husband with her body or her money that he, her son or husband, should learn Torah, then she gets schar with them. And her schar, her reward is great. Since they are mitzuvah va'isa, they're doing the mitzvahs that they're obligated in, the mitzvah of learning Torah, through her. And the Alter Rebbe concludes, nevertheless, also women are obligated to learn the halachas that they are chayiv in performing. Let's say the halachas of Shabbos, in order that they should know them, so that they could do the mitzvahs that they're chayiv in. And we have to understand over here, this that women are chayavas lilmid halachas atzrichas lehem, so that is Talmud Torah of women themselves. It's actual Talmud Torah, and it's also relevant to each and every woman. Whereas helping her son or husband to learn Torah is, number 1, helping and not learning. Number 2, her connection is to their reward, not to the actual learning itself. Number 3, it's only by a woman who has a husband or a son. You can add number 4, and the husband or son need help. And number 5, it's not something unique for women. Anyone can help somebody to learn Torah. And so if that's the case, the Alter Rebbe should start and teach the din of chayavas lumud halachas atzrichas lehen, and then teach im yezeres chulu. First say the more, what would seem prominent one, that they themselves have to learn Torah, and then add, and if they help, they also get schar. So first it starts and says that they're eina b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah, and then say, nevertheless, they have to learn their halachas, which is something of Talmud Torah itself that they have to learn. And in addition, if they help, they also get schar. So they do have some connection to Talmud Torah. Why is it organized that first Alter Rebbe talks about the helping and then of their own obligation to learn? Now we can say that since the Alter Rebbe wrote, P'tura mischar limud baneho, he started off and said, Isha ein b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah, and then he said immediately, Chashem she'ein b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah la'atzmo, kach ein b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah lebaneho. So since he mentioned that, so therefore he wants to conclude about the baneha, that mikol mokim im yezeres chulu, nevertheless, if she helps, she'll get the schar. But this itself requires understanding. Why did the Alter Rebbe indeed organize it in such a way that he started off and said, which therefore he would want to then say that imi azeres, she gets schar. Why did he do it this way and not reverse the order and start off that Isha in mitzvahs Talmud Torah and immediately say there, umikol makim gama nashim chayavas lumad halachas atzrichas lehen leida isan chulu, and then say uchashem shein mitzvahs Talmud Torah la'atzmo, also for baneha, and nevertheless if she helps. So the question basically is, why doesn't the Alter Rebbe first teach this, that nashim chayavas lumad halachas atzrichas lehen, which seems much more significant because it's the actual learning of Torah of women, and it's relevant to each and every woman, and then only afterwards teach about if they help, that they also get Chelekas B'schar. So in order to understand this, in order to answer this question, we're going to go into a side-related discussion and discuss something related to this, and then come back. So in Hilchos Birchas HaShachar, the Alter Rebbe writes that because of this reason, that women are chayavas limud mitzvahs shalehen, that women are obligated to learn their mitzvahs. They have to learn the parts of the Torah that talk about their mitzvahs, leida eich la'aseisan, in order to know how to perform the mitzvahs that they're obligated in. So the Alter Rebbe says, as a result of this, therefore women make birchas HaTorah. They make the brachas on the Torah. And the Alter Rebbe later adds another reason, which is not at all discussed in the Sicha, that it's because women are chayiv in davening, which is the Parshas or Karbonis, so therefore they have to make the Birchas HaTorah. But that's not discussed here in the Sicha. Now, from this, that women make Birchas HaTorah on their learning, and it's according to all opinions, because regarding a woman doing a mitzvah, she's not chayiv, and there's an argument whether she makes a bracha or not. But here the Alter Rebbe is saying she makes a bracha the same as a man does, according to all opinions. So this proves that their learning of the halachas at Sichos lehen is the inyan of Limud Torah itself. This is actually the inyan of Limud Torah that they have, and therefore they make a bracha on it. And it's not just a hechsher to their mitzvahs. It's not just something which is preparing for their mitzvahs, because if it's a hechsher mitzvah, like for example making a lulav, then there's no bracha. You don't make a bracha on making a lulav because you need that in order to do the mitzvah. So also here, if it's just learning Torah to know the mitzvahs and there's no Limud Torah as a thing for itself, there wouldn't be a bracha on it. The fact that they make a bracha on it, that proves that this is the inyan of Limud Torah itself. And there are 4 questions here. The first question is, what is the source in Gemara that woman learning the halachas at Sichos lehen is the inyan of Limud Torah itself, and not just a hachana, a preparation to fulfilling the mitzvahs they are chayiv in? What's the source for this? And that as a result, they make the bracha of Birchas HaTorah. Now, the simple meaning of what it says in the original teaching that we brought from the Gemara, indicates that they aren't part of Limud Torah at all. And like the Alter Rebbe writes over there in Hilchos Talmud Torah, Isha eina b'mitzvahs Talmud Torah. So what's the source for this? That women, their learning of the halachas at Sichos lehen is the actual inyan of Limud Torah itself, which as a result, they make the Birchas HaTorah. The second question is even more than the first question. The first question is just asking, where's the source? The second question is challenging that this is correct. Razal said in the Gemara of Brachas, Noshim b'may zachin, what is the schus of woman? Ba'akriya b'nayil beiknishta, uvasnuya gavraya chulu. It's by bringing their sons to learn Torah and by sending their husbands to learn Torah. And now, if their chiyuv to learn the halachas at Sichos lehen is a mitzvah for itself of Limud Torah, then what's the question of the Gemara? B'may zachin? B'may zachin? By their own Limud Torah. And also the answer should have been about their own Limud Torah. Why does the Gemara answer about the Limud Torah of bringing their sons and sending their husbands? It should be their very own Limud Torah itself. So from here it seems like their Limud Torah is not, their learning for knowing the mitzvahs is not the inyan of Limud Torah itself. The third question is, the Gemara in Maseches Saita asks, Schus demai, what's the schus that women have? Because the Mishnah over there says that a certain schus could stop the Meis Saita from affecting a woman for 3 years. So the Gemara asks, Schus demai, which schus is this? Ilema schus Torah, if you're going to say it's the schus of Torah, ha'ina mitzvah chulu, but she's not commanded to learn Torah. So we see that women on their own don't have schus Torah. If not for the help that they provide, like the Gemara says afterwards as the answer, that the schus Torah that they have is what it says in Gemara Brachas as well. It's because that they bring their sons and send their husbands to learn Torah. So we see that women don't have the Sichos Torah on their own. And the fourth question is, their chiyuv in Limud Torah is leida isan, to know the mitzvahs, and leida ichlas isan, to know how to do the mitzvahs. And if so, if she already knows all the halachas, then she no longer has the chiyuv, so she can't make Birchas HaTorah. And if that's the case, so why does the Alter Rebbe bring this as the first reason of why a woman makes Birchas HaTorah if it doesn't apply by all women? At the most, he should have brought it as an extra reason. He should have brought the second reason as the primary reason, and at the very most, he should have brought this as an additional reason, since it doesn't apply to all women. So now we're going to present the lead up into answering the first and fourth questions. So the explanation of all of this is as follows. It says in Gemara regarding a Nochri, a non-Jew who learns Torah of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, that Shenamar, it says about the Torah, Asher Yasa Odom Gomer, that Odom does it. Kehanim Levim v'Yisraelim Leinamar Chulu. It doesn't say over here Asher Yasa about Kehanim Levim and Yisraelim. Lamadta, so you learn from here, Shafilu Nochri v'Isaac B'Torah, Harei Hu K'Chayin Gadol, that even if it's a non-Jew and he is Isaac in Torah, he's like a Chayin Gadol. Now this greatness of Harei Hu K'Chayin Gadol that happens in a Nochri who learns Torah of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach comes from the greatness that's found specifically in learning Torah. It's connected to Torah itself. And like Tosfos indeed explains, that the reason it mentions a Chayin Gadol over here is because it says about the Torah that Yikara Hi Mipninim, that the Torah is Yikar Mipninim, and we learn from here that it's more precious Mikayin Gadol Hanichnas Lifnai V'Lifnim. And this greatness comes from the greatness of Torah itself. And it's just that by Yid it says that he's greater than a Kohen Gadol. Yikarahi mipninim, it's even more precious than the Kohen Gadol that goes Lifnai V'Lifnim. And by the Goy, it's as great as the Kohen Gadol that enters Lifnai V'Lifnim. So we see from the Gemara over here that the Goy has a Sichos to Torah itself, and it's not understood. The Torah is Meirasha Kilos Yaakov. It's an inheritance for the Yidden. It was only given to Yidden and not B'nai Noach. And this that they are permitted to learn Torah, even though we say a Ben Noach who learns Torah is Chayiv Misa, is because they are commanded to fulfill the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, and so they have to learn these halachas in order to do their mitzvahs. It's not possible otherwise. But from where do they have the greatness of Torah itself? How does that happen? They have to learn it. It's impossible to do their mitzvahs without learning Torah, so they'll learn Torah. But what's the explanation for this, that we're saying that they actually have a connection to the greatness of Torah itself as an independent thing, unrelated to leading to something else? So we must say that since B'Poel, bottom line, and actuality, a Ben Noach must learn the halachas of these mitzvahs, therefore, even though it's only in order to fulfill the mitzvahs that he's chayiv in, nevertheless, since they now have to learn Torah, therefore they have all the aspects of one who is learning Torah. They get connected to the Torah itself. In other words, what we're saying here is a Ben Noach learning Torah about the Sheva mitzvahs. So even though originally it's not for the learning of Torah itself, but rather for something else, simply to fulfill the mitzvahs, meaning that it's a necessary achana for the mitzvahs, it's impossible not to have this part. But nevertheless, through this, it becomes something for itself, an independent thing, and they have the learning of Torah itself as something independent, and therefore he has the greatness of Torah that Harehu Kechayin Gadol. And an example for this is, according to a number of opinions, and that's the halacha, one of the avodas that machshava peselis ba, if a person has the wrong thought in the avodah of the carbon, it makes it possible, is halacha, the walking of the blood to the mizbeach. And the Rogatchover explains that even though halacha is only needed to do the zrika that comes afterwards, it's not one of the avodas, it's just there because it's impossible to do the zrika afterwards if you don't do the halacha from where the shchita occurred. But nevertheless, once and since it's needed, it gets its own significance, and machshava peselis ba. And so too over here, even though the learning of Torah is only to do the mitzvahs by the guy, but nevertheless, now that they have to learn Torah, it gets an importance of itself. And the simple explanation for this is because nothing is forced. If the things work out in such a way that the only way to do the zrika is through the halacha, then that means the halacha is part of the avodah. And so too here, if it works out in such a way that the only way to do the Sheva mitzvahs is through learning about it, then that learning, that Torah, gets a significance and it becomes something for itself on its own. And that's how a guy has a shaychus to limited Torah, as limited Torah, as the greatness of limited Torah, and Harehu Kechayin Gadol from learning about his Sheva mitzvahs. And this leads into answering our first and fourth questions. What is the source in Gemara that women learning the halachas of tzrichas len is the inyan of limited Torah itself? And also, why does the Alter Rebbe give this as a reason for the birchas Torah? If once a woman knows the halachas, she won't have to learn about them any longer. So we're going to answer based on what we just said. And similarly, just like by a Nachri, it's understood by the learning of Torah by women, the chiyuv of women to learn Torah. So even though it's not because of the mitzvah of learning Torah itself, but rather only leida ehech to know how to do their mitzvahs, meaning that it's something she must have in order to fulfill her mitzvahs. It's just a technical thing that's needed. But nevertheless, the learning becomes something for itself, and therefore they make birchas HaTorah. So that's the source. The source is from this Gemara that tells us about a Nachri. And since learning the halachas of these mitzvahs becomes an inyan for itself of limud Torah, so it's understood that it's no longer limited just to the time that tzricha leida eich la'aseisan. And therefore also a woman who knows all the halachas of her mitzvahs is still connected to limud Torah, and therefore she makes birchas HaTorah. Once she gets a connection to limud Torah, then she has that limud Torah even if she knows the halachas. Because since you need to know and learn Torah in order to know the halachas, that creates for her a connection to limud Torah. And if she now technically knows all the halachas, it doesn't change that she has a connection to limud Torah as a thing for itself. And according to this, it's understood why the Alter Rebbe writes this as the first and main reason for why women make birchas HaTorah. Because in this inyan, women have a connection to limud Torah itself. It's not a distant connection. It's a connection to limud Torah itself, because since it's a necessary preparation, it gets the importance and significance as an independent thing, something for itself. So that means through this, they actually have a connection to limud HaTorah itself. And based on this, we're now going to go back to our original question and also point out something about the second and third questions as well. However, according to this, that women have the inyan of limud Torah itself, so our original question and the other two questions are now greater. Our original question was, why doesn't the Alter Rebbe bring their chiyuv to learn Torah as the first thing, before mentioning how they get a schar for helping their son or husband? And also our second and third questions from the Gemara that ask, what's the schus of women? According to what we just explained, they have a very big schus of limud Torah itself, because they're chayiv in their mitzvahs, and they have to learn Torah to do their mitzvahs. So now they have the inyan of limud Torah for itself. So what's the Gemara asking? Noshim b'mai zachyan and schus demai, and also the Gemara's answer is about how they help their husbands and they help their sons. The Gemara's answer should have been, the schus is their own limud Torah. So our questions about the places where we find that a woman helping their husband is elevated above their own learning become strengthened, that we see that they have their own inyan of limud Torah. So why isn't that mentioned as the main thing, both by the Alter Rebbe in Hilchos Talmud Torah and also in the Gemaras that we asked about in questions 2 and 3? The explanation in this is as follows. Even though we explain that in the learning of the halachas atzrichas lehen, there is the inyan of limud Torah, but nevertheless, since it's as a result of the chiyuv in their mitzvahs, it's not something which they're commanded to do. It's something which results from their chiyuv in mitzvahs. So therefore we can't say it's mitzvahs Talmud Torah. They have the inyan of limud Torah. It becomes something for itself because it's needed, but they don't have mitzvahs Talmud Torah. And if they don't have mitzvahs Talmud Torah, so therefore we can't say they should get a reward like someone who is mitzvah va'isa in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. We know that if two people do something, one is mitzvah, one is commanded to do it, and the other one is not mitzvah, and they both do it. The reward of the mitzvah va'isa is greater than the one that's ain't a mitzvah va'isa. So even though the women have the inyan of limud Torah because they can't do their mitzvahs without it, and it gets a chashivas, an importance for itself, but they're still not mitzvah in limud Torah. And therefore, even when they're learning, they don't have the level of reward of mitzvah va'isa in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And like it's explained also regarding the learning of Torah of a ben noyach, that even though they have the inyan of Torah, like we said, they have the inyan of limud Torah, but the Gemara explains it's not on the level of a mitzvah va'isa. They're not commanded to. They're commanded to do their mitzvahs. It's impossible to do it without learning Torah. And their learning Torah now gets an entire cheshivitz for itself, but they're not mitzvah on the learning. According to this, we're going to answer our two questions from the Gemaras in Brachos and Seita. According to this, it's understood why the Gemara doesn't say that women have the schos of Torah because of the obligation to learn the halachas at Sichos lehen. It doesn't say that. Why not? Because when the Gemara says ha'ena mitzvah chulu, and then the Gemara asks over there, what schos do they have? You're going to say it's Torah, but they're not mitzvah in Talmud Torah. And then the Gemara answers, no, it is Torah. And the Gemara explains, what about your question? They're not mitzvah. So even though they're not commanded, but they have the schus of their husband or son. The intent over there in the Gemara is, when the Gemara says Hayna mitzvah, is not that we can't find the inyan of limud Torah by women. They have the inyan of limud Torah, but rather regarding the reward, we're talking about finding a reward on mipakta, on being commanded on mitzvahs Talmud Torah, on the mitzvah part, like one who's mitzvah va'isa. Why is the Gemara seeking that out? Because specifically the schus of mitzvahs Talmud Torah, of the mitzvah, is magna kulahai, has the ability to protect this that much. Like the Gemara in Seita over there says, that it'll affect that the waters of the Seita won't harm her for 3 years. To have such a powerful protection, that only comes not from having Talmud Torah itself, the inyan of limud Torah itself. That comes from being mitzvah va'isa in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And therefore, when women learn the halachas at Sichos lehen, so even though they have in it the preciousness of limud Torah, we say Yakari mipninim about their limud Torah. They have the preciousness of limud Torah itself. Nevertheless, she isn't mitzvah va'isa, and she doesn't have the schus of mitzvah va'isa. And that's what the Gemara over there is seeking out, the schus of mitzvah va'isa. And we're going to continue now and answer why her helping her son or husband is brought over there in the Gemara as something greater than their own limud Torah, and why the Alter Rebbe brings it as the main thing in Hilchos Talmud Torah when he says women are not chayav in Torah. The main thing he says that they do have in Talmud Torah is helping their son or husband. However, when an isha is zeres lebnoi lebayla, she helps her son or husband begufa ma'ida with her body and her money. She asks Torah that he should learn Torah. Then she is chelek schar imoim. Then she gets schar with them. Uschara gadol, and it's a great schar ma'achashem mitzuvim va'is mal yada, because they're mitzuvah va'isa through her, which this is the schus the Gemara over there talks about as well. The schus that she has by helping her son or husband. What are we talking about here? The explanation for this idea is, seemingly it's not understood. Why is she chelek schar imoim and their Torah learning? Because they do it through her. Why is she chelek schar imoim? Why does she get that schar together with them? This is like when a person gives money to a poor person who uses it for a mitzvah. Let's say he buys meals for Shabbos. We don't find anywhere that it says that the one who gave the tzedakah has a portion in the mitzvah. So how come over here she gets a portion in the mitzvah? It's a mitzvah to help someone. But why does she get a portion of the mitzvah that the person does with that help? The answer very simply is, when a person gives tzedakah to a poor person, the money becomes the poor person's. He gave it to the poor person. Who does it belong to? Now the poor person. And afterwards, when the poor person does a mitzvah with the money, so the poor person is doing it with their own money. This is their money that they received. However, here, when the woman is helping her son or her husband, the woman is helping her son or husband in the doing of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. That's what she's helping with. She is right now involved in helping the mitzvah of Talmud Torah by the poor person. The person gives tzedakah. He's not involved in giving the person Shabbos Suda. He's involved in giving them money. Now the money became theirs, and they do with it whatever they want. And they chose to do a mitzvah with it. Whereas over here, the woman is not involved in some general form of help. She's helping her son or husband in a very specific thing, in their learning Torah. And that's why she gets a connection to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah itself. Like we'll see an example for this. We find an example for this by the mitzvah of Puruvu. The Gemara says that a man and woman, they should do the mitzvah themselves. It's better to do it themselves and not through a shliach, because mitzvah ba yesemi b'shluchai and mitzvah ba yesemi b'shlucha. And the question is, what mitzvah does a woman have? The mitzvah of Puruvu is only for the man. So the Ran writes that even though a woman isn't mitzvah in the mitzvah of Puruvu, only the man is still mikol makim. Nevertheless, yesh lo mitzvah. She does have a mitzvah because she's helping the husband do his mitzvah. And the explanation for this idea is the way the husband fulfills his mitzvah of Puruvu is through v'davak beishtai v'hayu lebasar echad, meaning that the mitzvah that the husband has is fulfilled through both of them. And since she helps with the mitzvah, therefore, yesh la mitzvah. And now we can apply that here as well. Similarly here, we can even look at the words of the Ran. Mikol mokem yesh la mitzvah, because she has a mitzvah because she's helping. Let's apply it to limud Torah. Lebna oy lebayla, to her son or her husband in their learning. L'kayim mitzvah say. So similarly here, when she helps in limud Torah, so then the mitzvah is being done with her help, and therefore she also has a mitzvah. And so that answers why the Alter Rebbe, and why in the Gemara it brings this as the primary thing. Because in this, they don't just have the inyan of limud Torah, but they also have the added greatness of mitzvah va'isa in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And over here we can also see a certain theme in the Sicha, which is at the beginning we said how when you do something for something else, that thing gets connected to, it gets an importance of its own. Like the halacha becomes important on its own. Also, the learning of Torah of the woman, it's just to do their mitzvahs, but now that they have to do it, it gets an importance on its own. And then we take it a step further. Not only does it get an importance of its own, but when you do something for something else, it gets the importance of that other thing, like the mitzvah of va'isa. And also the order of the Sicha. We start off first with the more obvious thing, that if a woman is learning Torah in order to know her mitzvahs, which she has to do, it's impossible to do it otherwise, that then it gets its own importance. It gets connected to the thing itself of Limud Torah. And then we take it even further, that not only when she has to do it, but even when she chooses voluntarily to do something, like we're going to mention this also later in another section of the Sicha, even when she does it voluntarily and she does it for something else, it gets the importance of that other thing. We're going to now have two side discussions. Each will have a question and an answer. So, however, from the Ran himself, it's not clear what yesh la mitzvah means, because it can be explained in two ways. Number one is she has a mitzvah stam, meaning that even though she doesn't have the mitzvah to fulfill pruvu, nevertheless, since she helps her husband to fulfill his mitzvah of pruvu, therefore she also has a mitzvah, but she doesn't have the mitzvah rabbah of pruvu. Or we could explain it that she has the mitzvah of pruvu. And similarly, we can ask about the schar she gets when she helps her son or her husband to fulfill the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Does she have a mitzvah stam, or does she have the mitzvah of Talmud Torah? So from the words of the Gemara about the woman helping their son and husband, that palgan bahadayu, they divide the schar with them, and also from the words of the Alter Rebbe, that chelek schari mohem, that she divides a schar with them. So we see it's like the second way. It doesn't say she gets or takes schar. She's chelek schari mohem. So we see it's like the second way, that she has the connection to the actual mitzvah of Talmud Torah itself. And like we said before, since the mitzvah of Talmud Torah of the husband and son, that they are mitzvah on, is done with her help, so she has a part in their mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and that's why she is chelek schari mohem. And we can say the same thing by the mitzvah of puravu, that she has a connection to the mitzvah itself. So it comes out, before we brought puravu as an example or a proof that she has a connection and she gets a mitzvah, and now we're bringing it the other way, from the limud of Torah, we're bringing a proof that she's a connection to the mitzvah itself, and so too by pruvu, it's not to a mitzvah stam, it's to the mitzvah of pruvu. Now we're going to ask another side question. Since by helping her son or husband, a woman is chelek schari mohem, so she has a part in mitzvahs Talmud Torah with the mitzvah va'isa. So why didn't the Alter Rebbe also bring this in Hilchos Birchas HaShachar as a reason for making their bracha? Because now they have a connection not just to Limud Torah as an inyan for itself, but also to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, the mitzvah va'isa part. At least you should bring it as an added reason for Birchas Torah. So we're going to start off with a lead up to the answer. This will be understood by first discussing the question of Mefarshim on the Ran. The Gemara says that there was a certain woman that demanded a divorce because she didn't have any kids. So she was told, you're not commanded to have kids. You're not commanded on pruvu. So she said that she maybe is not commanded on pruvu, but she needs help when she gets older. She wants children, and they agree, and then it was agreed that she could then demand a divorce. And the Mefarshim ask, why doesn't it say that since she helps her husband in the mitzvah, so therefore she does have a connection to the mitzvah and the mitzvah of va'isa of pruvu, which is a lot better explanation. So the explanation is when she helps her husband, it's voluntary. So yes, if she helps, she gets the advantage of mitzvah va'isa. She has a connection to the mitzvah of the mitzvah va'isa part of the mitzvah. But she doesn't have a mitzvah to do it. It's voluntary. She's not mitzvah. And if she's not mitzvah, she can't demand it. She can't say, I want to get this special thing. She's not required to do it. If she was required, she could say, I have a chiyuv to do this. But she doesn't have a chiyuv. She's saying, I would like to get it for myself. That's not a reason, that's not grounds to demand a divorce. What would be grounds is that she wants to have children, or she even needs to have children to take care of her in her old age. And so similarly here, when a woman helps her husband and is chelekas b'schar, that's something that's up to her to do or not to do. It's voluntary. And according to this, it's understood why the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention that she helps even as an added reason for women making Birchas Torah. Because since there's no chiyuv for her to help, so we can't say that according to all opinions, even the opinions that say you only make a bracha on something you have to do, women make Birchas Torah for this reason. However, in Hilchos Talmud Torah, where the Alter Rebbe explains that even though Isha ain't of a mitzvah Talmud Torah, nevertheless she has a connection to this mitzvah. So there, the Alter Rebbe brings this as the first point, because through helping her son or husband, she's connected to mitzvahs Talmud Torah and with the whole Torah. And therefore, not just the parts that she's chayiv in. So she has mitzvahs Talmud Torah and the whole Torah. And therefore, she's chalek schar imarim like one who is mitzvah v'isa. Whereas the chiyuv of women to learn halachas atzrichas lehen, so even though through this they have an actual connection to the Torah and the Torah itself, nevertheless, since this comes as an extension from the chiyuv and their mitzvahs, therefore they don't have the quality of mitzvah v'isa. And that's why he brings it at the end after Azaris. He brings it as a second thing that they have to learn halachas atzrichas lehen. In Pnimis Einyonim, Hashem and the Yidden are Kavyochel called Ish v'Isha. Now the purpose of the creation of the world is Miluas Haaretz Chivshua, to fill the world, to populate the world, and to conquer it, which means to conquer the Olam Miloshen Helim, and to be mamshech into this Olam Miloshen Helim, the early key which is higher than the Olam. And it's Ish, Ze HaKadosh Baruch Hu Darkei Lichbesh. It's the Eibishter who has the ability to conquer, because the creation doesn't have the ability on its own to change nature, to conquer the world. Only Hashem has that ability. And this shlichus to conquer the world is actually done by Yidden. How do we do it if we don't have the power? It's through the strength of Torah, which was given to us by Hashem. Because the Torah, even when it comes down to this world, remains higher than the world. And therefore, Razal said, Kol chafetzim lo yishvava, that no chafetzim are compared to it, that even chafetzei shamayim, which are the mitzvahs, can't compare to the Torah, since they are mislabish in physical things. However, the Torah, even after it's mislabish in physical things, it says about the Torah, haloi koi dvari ka'ish, that it remains higher than the physical, and therefore it's higher than chafetzei shamayim, because Torah is not chafetzei shamayim, it's actually shamayim itself. And so it's through the power of the Torah that Hashem gave us that we have the ability to do this shlichus of miluas haaretz chivshua. And through the Yidden learning Torah, so they unite with Torah, and through this we become a balabayas over the nature of the world. We could conquer the world. So by learning Torah, we unite with the Torah, and since the Torah is higher than the world, so it gives us the ability to also be higher than the world and to be able to conquer the nature of the world. And since the Yidden help in this avodah to conquer the world, so even though the strength for it comes from Hashem through the Torah, so since we are helping, like women help in the mitzvah of Puravu, and the women help in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and they get connected to the actual mitzvah v'isa part. So too we become partners with Hashem in this mitzvah and avodah, which is the whole purpose of creation. And like the Maimer Razal of Nasa Shutuf LaKadosh Baruch Hu b'Maisa Bereshis, we actually become a Shutuf with Hashem in Maisa Bereshis.